This program is a paid commercial announcement and in no way represents the views of WPHT or its management.
Now on Talk Radio 1210, WPHT, WPHT-HD, WOGL HD3 Philadelphia. It's Legal Eagles Radio with Sam Pond. From the courtroom to the boardroom to Talk Radio 1210. Get educated on the law from one of the most powerful attorneys in the country. Legal Eagles Radio with Sam Pond, featuring who's who in the Delaware Valley legal community. Welcome to the courtroom, and welcome to Legal Eagles Radio, and your host, Sam Pond.
And we welcome everyone in on the final weekend of October as we come to you across the state of Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia on Talk Radio 1210, WPHT, and in Pittsburgh on your hometown radio station, KDKA. This is Legal Eagles Radio with Sam Pond. It's a mid-election special with a panel of very influential special guests who are going to provide some clarity as we go into the midterm elections while finding some balance, Sam, in the words common sense. And I come to you and say hello to you and welcome in.
Well, thanks, Joe. Look, we're a week out, a little bit more than a week out, and we're going to have our second segment next week in regard to the election. We have an all-star cast to talk to us about the midterm elections, not only in the state level but in the federal level. We can also talk local politics. This show is about, as we all remind our listeners, and we're starting to get more and more listeners, so you know what it's about, but the new listeners need to know that this is about educating yourself through this platform about your legal rights, which we can all agree is extremely important. I think it's more important than getting a set of knives and how a pair of knives cut or knowing the latest diet fad. This is where the rubber meets the road for you to be a citizen. And right now, to express yourself as a citizen and to understand the laws is about voting. Because the connection is politics/government is where the laws are made. Then you are stuck with the laws that are made. So you better get involved. You better hear your voice. You have your voice heard. You better get educated, and we can talk. We can continue to talk about knowledge is power. Knowledge is power. And if you start getting informed about who the people you're voting for and what they are enacting as laws and how that affects your life, you should be aware of it. Or if you're middle-class folk coming from a neighborhood and have a job and a union employee and you want to protect your union job and you have a collective bargaining agreement, are you aware of the term right to work? Are you going to vote for someone that has that term, that is a PR term really enacted by or discovered and created by the Koch brothers to eliminate the ability to collectively bargain? If you're middle class and paying into the Social Security system, are you going to say and buy the rhetoric about Social Security being an entitlement and therefore saying that I'm going to vote for someone and supporting someone that's going to gut the Social Security system, that's going to take away your Medicare, that's going to take away your Social Security retirement, that's going to take your ability to apply for Social Security disability benefits? I don't think so. But you better know who you're voting for, because quite frankly, I know a lot of people that are voting against their interests. And it's happening across the country. Why is it happening across the country? Why are you voting against your financial and social interests? You know why? Because you're not getting educated. You're not finding out about the candidates. You got to know what they stand for. And you just can't be sitting down and on your hands and not being a participant in the process. Look, this is how it works, folks. You go out, you vote. The people that you vote for and are elected, and we have 3 public officials, and we have 2 active public officials here, and we have 1 ex-public official, that all understand that they were public servants. What's a public servant? They are there to serve the public. You're their boss. You, the voter, you, the citizen, are their boss. You hold them accountable. So are you going to support someone that supports violence against the press? Are you going to support someone that doesn't come out and say wow, what is going on with these pipe bombs? What are you going to do about a bully? What are you going to do about people lying in office? You have to really get engaged and have to really understand. But let's stay on mission. Let's stay on mission of the program, because politics ties in directly to the law, because our public officials make the law. So having said that, Joe, we have a lot to cover this hour and next week's hour. And we have experts to talk about the process, about the midterm elections, about their predictions, about the candidates, where everyone is at in the state and the federal landscape. So let's get going. Let's get started and let's get educated.
This is Legal Eagles Radio with Sam Pond in Philadelphia on Talk Radio 1210 WPHT, in Pittsburgh on your hometown radio station, KDKA. Back in a moment.
If you want to talk with Sam Pond or any one of his legal experts, call 800-568-7500. That's 800-568-7500.
And welcome back, everyone, to Legal Eagles Radio with Sam Pond. It's a political special along with J. Duck. I'm Joe Kraus as we come to you on what is the final weekend of the month of October. And as you said, Sam, when the show opened up and in your opening monologue, now within range, within vision is Election Day, as it's coming up on the other side of the corner. And it's all out there for all of our listening, for the listening audience. Those for, those against, they'll make the decision.
I think this is really an opportunity and a timely show in light of, I think, maybe the most contentious election cycle that I've ever seen, with the gap, the separation, this amount of animosity and acrimony that exists between the parties and people really digging in. And we're going to have a dialogue here with folks that I think are worried about our system. They're going to be objective in regard to the landscape and people's ability to vote and that constitutional right to vote. But let's introduce our guest, because Pennsylvanians, you're well aware of our guests, and unless you haven't been reading a paper or turning on a TV or not even been awake, and I know you're all awake, but our guests today are significant. We have Jonathan Seidel, the previous controller of the city of Philadelphia, and Jonathan has been very much involved in Philadelphia politics for decades, and you're going to love hearing his voice and his perspective. We have Senator Hughes, who's a leader of the Democratic caucus out of the 7th District here in Philadelphia, who has been a constant leader, constantly engaged, a great public servant for his constituents, and obviously Governor Rendell, the previous district attorney of the county of Philadelphia, and the mayor of Philadelphia, and a great governor and a great public servant who is not only known locally and statewide and regionally, but nationally, if not internationally. So I want to thank all of you for taking the time to be here today to talk about this most important political cycle.
Thank you, Sam.
Let's start out. Look, I just want everyone to understand, again, education. We want to make this clear and very basic for the listeners. We have local politics, we have state politics, and we have federal politics. And in the midterm elections right now, we are looking at the federal landscape where we don't have a presidential cycle, but we have the U.S. Senate race here in Pennsylvania. We have Senator Casey up for re-election. And we have a number of significant congressional seats. But let's back up and talk about the congressional seats in regard to where we're at in regard to the districts and something called gerrymandering. Because we have a little bit of a different situation as a result of our Supreme Court changing the districts. And I'd like to have in a really plain talk, to educate our listeners exactly what gerrymandering is and redistricting, and what's been the consequence now on the federal landscape.
Senator? I'll jump in, and thanks, Sam, for having me with these two very powerful and important public figures for many, many years. You know, the Supreme Court, I'll start with the back of the conversation first. The Supreme Court here in Pennsylvania, the oldest Supreme Court in the country, the nation's first Supreme Court, better said that way, made a decision I'll say the midpoint of this year, I believe it was in May, June, that time frame, if I remember correctly, to adjust a wrong that was done almost a decade ago in how the congressional districts were drawn in Pennsylvania. Just as a context, Pennsylvania has 1 million more Democratic, registered Democrats than Republicans, but the congressional districts that were drawn 10 years ago resulted in, 13 Republican congresspeople and 5 Democratic congresspeople. The districts were drawn in a very partisan fashion, and from a legal standpoint, as you and these other two gentlemen are attorneys, the whole one person, one vote rule was violated based on the way those districts were drawn almost 10 years ago. So the Pennsylvania Supreme Court made a decision earlier this year to redraw the lines to make them fair, make them equal, make them in many respects nonpartisan, but make them more representative and consistent with the one person, one vote situation. So now Pennsylvania has a very competitive congressional election cycle that we're going through, whereas the election cycle for Congress people beforehand under the old lines was not competitive because of the way the lines were drawn.
And that's on the federal level right
now. And that's right. On the federal level.
That's not applying to the
not to the state
races,
level,
but that'll come soon or not.
That'll come soon enough.
John, chime in on this.
You know what? The thing that's interesting is that and people have to realize the interrelationships between who they elect as state House members and state senators, as well as who elect as governor, and how that affects their congressional races. Reapportionment is done every 10 years, and those that control the House and the Senate actually control
Let me interrupt you,
reapportionment.
because, again, we're trying to educate. Why is it done every 10 years? Consensus?
Yes, that's it's our census is done every 10 years. So
yes.
they do. I wish there was consensus, but they do the census every 10 years, and then they base on reapportionment. The interesting thing about the reapportionment is that if the Republicans control the legislature and the governor, they effectively control the way in which our congressional races are apportioned. Now, it's one person, one vote, but there's also supposed to be part of the law some sort of commonality of interest. So what you see now is Madeline Dean running in Montgomery County, because if you live in Montgomery County, you're going to have the same commonality of interest because you live within that county as before. Congressman Boyle took part of it. You had some other people taking part of it. And if you looked at those districts from 20,000 feet in a plane, it's absolutely amazing how they would draw the lines to keep the same amount of people in each district, but there was no relationship between where the end of a congressional district was as compared to the other end. So now we have districts where there's like kinds, like elected officials, and a commonality of interest that we can then say, hey, she's going to represent Montgomery County.
I had Brendan Bellotti here do some research for me about gerrymandering, just so everyone understands it. We're looking at this term that came about back in 1812
right.
because they started some politicians started to pack districts, the definition is diluting the voting power of the opposing party supporters across many districts, and packing or concentrating the opposing party's voting power in one district to reduce their voting power in another district. Gerrymandering may also be used to help or hinder a particular demographic, such as a political, ethnic, racial, linguistic, religious, or class group. And we've seen that in North Carolina, where they divided this on racial lines, and the United States Supreme Court came out unanimously, very rare, and said this is clearly racially based, it's discriminatory. But what we have when we have gerrymandering is we basically have the politicians telling us how to vote, as opposed to voters having the free will to vote, right? I mean, that's really what's happening.
Yeah.
So we've now got this change that if you look at the new congressional map, based on what the Supreme Court did, and I'm being objective here, bipartisan, it's fair. It looks normal. It makes sense. The other thing looked like this crazy jigsaw puzzle that didn't make any sense. But again, you're packing the district so that despite having 1 million less voters, you can control the legislative districts, both on the federal level and on the state level. Now we've cured it on the state level,
right?
What has to happen to fix it on the federal? On the federal level, what needs to be happen to cure it on the state level?
Well, the first thing that has to happen is obviously an extensive and a strong voter turnout on November 6th, which we all do better when we're all voting. Okay, right. The country is better, communities are better when more people are engaged in the voting process. So a strong vote on November 6th is important. Then, as you talked about earlier with the census, Sam, in 2020, there'll be an effort to do a census, which is a count of every person in the United States of America. Every person in the United States of America gets counted. And then in 2021, we'll go about redrawing the lines at the legislative level. Now, at the legislative level in Harrisburg, we have a commission. And the commission is represented by 4 caucuses. A representative from each of the 4 caucuses it has to be a person that the leaders of each one of the 4 caucuses in Harrisburg, the House Democrats, House Republicans, Senate Democrats, Senate Republicans, and then the 5th person is chosen as the chair. The 5th person is chosen by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. And so that person that'll be the commission. The commission will review lines, they will review districts, and then they'll make a determination based on the plans that are submitted to the commission of what the legislative districts look like. But it's based first and foremost on the census. And if we don't have an accurate, and this is extremely, extremely important, we've had this conversation privately before, if we don't have an accurate, aggressive, thoughtful count where everybody is pulled in and everybody is counted, then everything that follows from there will be essentially corrupt, will not be exact. And that is very problematic because resources are determined based on that. Businesses are set up based on census numbers.
Funding percentages in the budget?
Funding for education, right, or for economic development or whatever. Businesses use the census data, all right, to make their decisions about where to locate and what kind of business is set up. Everything is dependent upon that. And it can be very hard to get an accurate count. I'll give you an example. In 2010, you had President Obama, and you had Mayor Nutter here in the city of Philadelphia, both individuals who were thoughtfully working hard to get an accurate count. They did a first pass for the city of Philadelphia. Mayor Nutter said, that doesn't sound right. That number doesn't sound right. Something seems to be off at that. So they created an overlap organization that went back into communities and found 130,000 additional people on top of the first count that was done. Now, that's significant.
Was that a negligence or was that something that was intentional?
It's well you have.
Are there shenanigans going on here? Or is it just incompetence?
I don't believe that. I believe
I do.
that
I always believe there's shenanigans.
Well, I don't believe there's shenanigans because you had 2 individuals, the President Obama and Mayor Nutter, who wanted an accurate count. They wanted everybody to
be counted. Thank God they did.
Okay, yeah. And thank God they did. And then when there was a question, there was an opportunity to try to fix that and go out one more time and go deeper into various neighborhoods and find folks. And so they did that. The problem that we have right now, as you're aware and your listeners are aware, coming up in 2020, we're sitting in a presidency where there's a lot of pushback on this whole issue of accurate count. Is the Census Commission being funded at an appropriate level to have enough folks out in neighborhoods? All right, are they asking the right questions on the paper document that goes out to every American citizen? So all of that is out there. That's why. Final point. That's why this election is so important, because if you have the right folks in Congress and the right folks at the state level, then you can force a system that goes out and gets an accurate count.
Well, John, let's talk about the shenanigans. Let's talk about why not the funding. What's the purpose of not funding an accurate census in light of its importance? Why would a public official not want to have an accurate census?
Well, if the other party is in control of the state, a place like Philadelphia, Allegheny County, that are predominantly Democrat, the less of our census, the less money we can actually get from the federal government when it comes to education, quality of life, Department of Human Services, all the social programs that we attempt to get through grants and initiatives through this Harrisburg are based upon the percentage of poverty, the population that we need to control and help and move forward. And if I was Donald Trump, you would try to break it down to zero, so you have a very small amount of people that are going around doing interviews.
This is Legal Eagles Radio with Sam Pond. This is a Legal Eagles political special in Philadelphia on Talk Radio 1210 WPHT and in Pittsburgh on your hometown radio station, KDKA.
Now back to Legal Eagles Radio with Sam Pond. Talk Radio 1210 WPHT.
This is Legal Eagles Radio with Sam Pond. This is a Legal Eagles political special in Philadelphia on Talk Radio 1210 WPHT and in Pittsburgh on your hometown radio station, KDKA.
Well, look, this is the kind of information that our folks, our listeners really need to know about and get educated about, and call their public officials and say, demand that we have an accurate count in the census. And it's interesting, usually the disenfranchised,
Right.
and the folks that are, socioeconomically are more disadvantaged are the ones that are going to get excluded, and generally they're Democratic voters. And they're generally urban.
right.
And we're missing out on them, and we don't want to go out and put the effort in. It's not acceptable. That's not our democracy, because every citizen counts.
Every citizen.
And everyone has to be counted in order to make these kind of decisions
Absolutely.
for funding, etc. We're a week away. It's too late to vote. But I think if anyone's missed the boat in regard to voting in this cycle, they need to register. And I'm going to tell all our listeners, if you need to register to vote, you just call our office. Call our office, call our hotline, and we will get out the information to you to register to vote. If you need an educational tutorial on how to vote, call our office, and we'll make sure that happens. We want everyone's voice to be heard. That's a citizen in our counties, in our state, and in our government, in our federal landscape. And we have listeners. By the way, we have listeners outside of Pennsylvania. We have listeners in New Jersey. We have listeners in New York. We have listeners in Delaware, and Maryland, and Ohio, and West Virginia. We want all of you to get engaged. It's extremely important. You can't complain. If you're not going to get engaged and you're not going to get on the field, then you can't complain. You got to get in the ball game. You got to wake up. You can't be a fool. You can't be taken advantage of. You got to get engaged, and we're trying to help you get engaged. So let's continue the Joe Doc, you have one? You want to get something in here?
Yes, Sam. When you opened up, you talked about individuals voting against their interests. And the last time the governor was on, we talked about voting with their emotions. And I'm really interested in this conversation about the local and statewide and federal levels. But let's look at it at the presidential level and electoral college. I mean, people, you get your disenfranchised voters, but you get your people that don't think that their vote counts.
Right.
And it's very difficult to have a presidential election and look at the popular vote and still, you lose the election. And in many ways, it gives, for example, the Republicans an opportunity to campaign in those votes in those states that where they have the electoral college votes. And my point is, why does that? I know it's 200 years old, but the question is, why does that still go on? How can America still have a presidential election where one party strategically targets states that obviously where they can win the election but lose the popular vote?
John, Senator?
We could spend more hours than you have allotted for this conversation. The efforts around voter suppression that are going on all around the country are repulsive, but they're organized. They're strong. We got a governor's race in Georgia, where
80,000 people. Yeah.
Right, where the Secretary of State is running for governor, and the Secretary of State
and running the election,
and the Secretary of State in the state of Georgia is responsible for the election process in the state. All the voter registration forms come through his office. Everything in the electoral process comes through his office. And the most recent allegation is that there are 53,000 voter registration forms in his office that he's just sitting on, not processing. The overwhelming percentage of them are African American forms, okay? And suspicion would be largely Democratic. So he's running for governor, sitting on folks who want to vote, sitting on voter registration forms who want to vote. You know, so
these are the kind of things, though, I think we all have to get on top of a mountaintop.
Well, I agree with you because
and yell about, but it also gets to the point of the Secretary of State position in each one of our states.
Right, but it's what people and somebody once said this, and it was.
This is a civics course, by the way.
No, I totally agree.
This is exactly why we want to educate
the
people.
Presidential elections, it's the only position you can run for where there's an electoral college. And I was thinking as I was coming onto this set was it's almost it's almost like a way of gerrymandering.
It is
at the presidential level.
It was placed in the Constitution because there was one way that you could get the smaller states to vote for the Constitution because it gave them an opportunity to have a voice. The states decide whether it's all or nothing, like in Pennsylvania, it's all or nothing. Some states, if you win 60%, the other guy gets 40, you get 60% in the electoral college, the other guy gets 40. It's not uniform. And look, what was it, 80,000 votes that separated Trump from...
Exactly.
So he lost the entire Pennsylvania because of a couple counties.
It's unbelievable.
Well, do you want to chime in at all on this, Governor, about what we're talking about in regard to Joe has the idea of the electoral college and electoral college, and by the way, we understand our founding fathers did a pretty damn good job, and it goes back to the small states. It's exactly why we have U.S. senators in
That's
two
exactly
states,
right.
because we wanted the small states to be protected, even though they have the same amount of voice. A small state like Rhode Island has the same voice as California. Whether or not that is something that we should reconsider, it's not going to happen on a constitutional amendment, that's for sure. But that's what we're stuck with. That's what the founding fathers gave us. We have to abide by it. Governor?
Well, I think that Senator Hughes and former Controller Seidel did a brilliant job. I was sitting here absolutely awed by their intelligence or perception and the way they explained it to people in a
Could I have a tape of that?
in a rational, easy to understand form. I think they did a great job. So, can I be excused?
Yes. They've covered it all.
No, I just have to make one correction, only because I know that Sam Pond, being one of the greatest lawyers perhaps ever to live in the Commonwealth, he is dragging about accuracy. No state splits their electoral college votes by the percentage of vote gotten in the election. There are two states that divide their electoral college votes by congressional district.
Oh, that's right, congressional district.
Nebraska and Maine. So that you can, in Maine, let's say you win the popular vote in the state of Maine, but you lose one of the two congressional districts. Well, your opponent gets one electoral vote, and you get the two that you win from carrying the state, plus the one congressional district, 3-1. And Nebraska gets the same, except Nebraska has four electoral votes.
Sounds right.
So that's important.
Yes, that's true.
Actually, what Jonathan Seidel suggested would make the Electoral College much more fair and representative. For example, Donald Trump won, as you all will recall, our host and the two other eminent guests will recall that Donald Trump won Pennsylvania with about 48% of the vote. Hillary Clinton got 47%, and the two third-party candidates split the remaining 5%. So instead of Donald Trump getting all 18 of our
Electoral college votes.
Our electoral college votes, excuse me, it was 20 at the time. All 20 of our electoral college votes, he would have gotten 9.5. Hillary Clinton would have gotten 9, and the two third-party candidates would have split half of electoral college vote themselves. Now, that's fair because Hillary Clinton would have gotten almost as many electoral college votes as Trump received, and she wouldn't have lost all 20 votes given the fact that she lost the state. Now, that would only work if it where there was a constitutional change requiring every state to have that. It would have to be uniform. If every state had that system, the Electoral College would more closely reflect the popular vote.
That's exactly right.
In fact, I've done the math on this. If that system were in effect, Hillary Clinton would have gotten a plurality of Electoral College votes, 256 Electoral College votes, more than Trump, or certainly more than the third-party candidates, but not enough to have the 270 that the Constitution requires to be elected president. So that election would have been sent to the House of Representatives, and that's nothing anybody would want to see either. So it's not so easy to get rid of the Electoral College vote. Some people say, well, why forget about the Electoral College? Let's just have a popular vote. Whoever gets the most votes wins. All right. Let's suppose that Hillary Clinton, instead of beating Donald Trump in the popular vote by 3 million, she beat Donald Trump in the popular vote by 17,000 votes. That would mean you would have a recount in every precinct in America. Every precinct in America would have to have a recount. Because remember, you're counting all the votes, every vote in Maine, every vote in Nebraska, every vote in New York, and you wouldn't know who the president would be until the following March. So going to a strict popular vote is not so easy either. So,
well, do you think there's a real need for the Electoral College now? I mean, there's some history. There's some history that tags the way we see the Electoral College right now, which comes out of as more folks got engaged in the electoral process, as the franchise was extended to women, to African Americans, and all of that. That there was a movement to move towards the Electoral College to essentially disenfranchise all of these new folks coming into the system.
Well, the popular vote, as I said, the biggest problem with going to a strict popular vote is if it's close, you literally have to recount every precinct in America. And that would be a horrible fiasco. Can you imagine in the current vitriolic atmosphere having a nationwide recount because one candidate got 17,000 votes out of 68 million more than the other?
The Electoral College is also supposed to force candidates nationwide to go to areas that they may not normally have gone to because of
the argument is that you now have to go to a smaller state that has 5 Electoral College votes or 3 or whatever.
Right.
Whereas if it was just a popular vote, you'd concentrate on the big 10 or 11 states. But the fallacy of that argument, Jonathan, is, as you know, today, with some states being certain Republican states and other states being certain Democrat
California.
states.
Happens already.
No one puts TV ads on in California, the biggest state of all anymore.
All that was set up.
It's exactly the opposite of
Right.
That's right. All those
It saves Governor Rendell a lot of money since he doesn't have to.
But that's the ironic thing. That
and remember, the Constitution was set up when we didn't have political parties. They didn't want political parties.
But initially it was for the small states. Now no one's going to California.
Who's this guy? He looks like a stew bum from a homeless guy.
We're just trying to do diverse. We're trying to be diverse.
But listen, the presidential election is conducted in about 11 states.
Yeah.
The other 39 states, the Republicans are going to win Texas. Democrats are going to win New York, so no one campaigns in those states anyway. So that's the fallacy of that. That was the original thought of the framers, that by giving each state some Electoral College votes, it would force the presidential candidates to campaign in that state. We don't see that anymore.
No.
But if we had the proportional Electoral College system
you'd have to.
that you inadvertently suggested,
I thought of it deep in my mind.
Well,
Inadvertently deep in his mind.
I think the greater injustice may be having 2 Senate representatives from each state. And when you look at Wyoming having 2 senators and California having 2, you know, to say that the 1 million or 800,000 people in Wyoming are going to have the same voice than the 40 million in California, that to me
doesn't make a lot of sense.
Is problematic, because really you're not getting representation for the 40 million times, or less 39 million in Wyoming.
And Sam, let me give you a graphic example of that, which of course Senator Hughes and Controller Seidel know. When Barack Obama became president in 2009, the Democrats controlled the Senate and the House. The Democrats had, I think, 56 senators. The Republicans had 44. But because of the filibuster rule,
60.
You need 60 votes. So in those days, the Republicans or anybody could have stopped legislation from happening if 41 senators who represented 17% of the nation's population were against it.
Say that again, because I think our listeners need to hear that once again in regard to how our Constitution is structured and the consequence now because of what we have in the way of population. Say it again.
They could have stopped any proposal that President Obama put forward if 41 Republican senators voted for it, and those 41 represented states that accounted for 17% of the nation's population.
So despite 83 out of 100 Americans wanting a certain policy, it's going to be stopped by the minority of 17%. Now, no, we're basically driven by a majority.
Mm-hmm.
The majority of the folks are going to drive what we have in the way of laws. But this is intriguing. First of all, I think we need about 5 hours to cover this. We're going to turn into the House races, which are governed, the House of Representatives, which are governed by population, and we have 18.
Sam, before we go to break, let me say that the framers had some wisdom in what they did.
Much wisdom.
Because the theory is that sometimes the majority of the population can be driven into a frenzy and be for something that was very destructive. For example, the incarcerating of Japanese Americans. We put Japanese American citizens in prison, essentially, for no other reason than they were Japanese American in their heritage, when there were Japanese American boys dying and fighting on our side of the war.
Well, the most decorated outfit during the Second World War was the Japanese American outfit that fought in Italy. They had the highest casualty rates and the most medals per unit. So they were true patriots, but you're right. Good point, Governor.
This is Legal Eagles Radio with Sam Pond. We'll take a short break and finish up with hour number 1 of the election special.
Oh, yay, oh, yay, oh, yay. God save the United States and this honorable court.
Talk Radio 1210, WPHT, Legal Eagles Radio with Sam Pond.
And that Legal Eagles Radio hotline is 1-800-723-8715, 1-800-723-8715.
Joe, we're not going to hope, regrettably on this hour, it looks like we're not going to be able to talk about some of the issues in regard to the House of Representatives, but we want to talk about the candidates there. I do want to turn to the western part of the state and talk about Connor Lamb.
Right.
We have such polarization, we have such extremes, and quite frankly, as we all know, the majority of Americans are in the middle. You know, my mother was a good old-fashioned Rockefeller Republican, and my father was an FDR Democrat.
New Deal.
My father was actually a little bit more extreme than my mother. We want to look at a race, I think, that really talks about someone that's moderating and looking at all the different issues, both social issues, fiscal issues, and that would be Connor Lamb out in the West. Governor, what did Connor do? That district went for Trump big. It was I think the special election was before we have the redistricting. Tell us about that race and your impressions of it.
Yeah, Donald Trump won that district by 11 points over Hillary Clinton, and Connor Lamb was not given much of a chance when he started out. But Connor Lamb turned out to be a great candidate for the district in the sense that his views reflected the views of the majority of the people who lived in the district. That doesn't mean that Connor isn't courageous and doesn't take some difficult stands. He does. But his views were for Democrats who live in San Francisco or the west side of New York. Connor Lamb would have been considered almost not a Democrat because he was conservative on some fiscal issues and some issues involving social causes,
Second Amendment,
things like that. So Democrats would say to me, well, why are we giving money to Connor Lamb? He doesn't believe in our values. Well, the answer is both political parties, but certainly we Democrats, should reflect people who have views that cover all sides of the spectrum, as long as they adhere to our core value. And what's the core value of the Democratic Party? I think it's easy to enunciate. We want economic fairness in America. We want an economic policy that gives everyone a chance to have a sustainable income that can build a decent life for themselves and their families. We want economic fairness. We don't want tax cuts to go 83% to the top 1% wage earners in the country. If we're going to have tax cuts, we want them shared by the people who need them the most. Sam Pond doesn't need a tax cut. I mean, Sam Pond could live on the money he makes for the rest of his natural life without earning another dime.
I'm not going to argue. It's so true. I don't need a tax cut. Let my clients get a tax cut.
So Connor Lamb was a good Democrat when it came to economic values and economic fairness. I don't care that much that Connor Lamb was for the Second Amendment rights, because Connor Lamb understood that Second Amendment rights didn't mean, for example, not voting for universal background checks. 90% of Americans for universal background checks. So Connor Lamb's a good Democrat. Joe Manchin's a good Democrat. When Joe Manchin voted for Kavanaugh, I tweeted out on my Twitter, I said, Joe Manchin is a good Democrat who believes in the economic fairness that's the key to our party's values. I disagree with him on his Kavanaugh vote, but we shouldn't beat up on him so much because he's a good Democrat. And I got savaged on Twitter for that because he didn't vote for Judge Kavanaugh. Well, in West Virginia, I would imagine 90% of the population would have voted to approve Judge Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. And Joe is reflecting the votes of his constituency. So I think it's very, very important that we have moderate Democrats, we have progressive Democrats, we have socialist Democrats. Some of the young people who've been elected who call themselves social democrats, there's a place for them in the party, just like there's a place for conservative Democrats, the Joe Manchins, the Phil Bredesons. And I think if we had an audience of a panel of Republicans, Sam, they'd say the same thing. Nelson Rockefeller was a good Republican. By current standards, he'd be considered a progressive. Barry Goldwater would be considered a moderate now.
We have some good moderate Republicans.
Charlie Dent.
We have some good moderate Republicans in our Commonwealth. I don't agree with what they stand for, but there's a lot of good, solid, moderate Republicans that are responding to their constituency, whether it's a labor issue, whether it's a social issue. They may be fiscally conservative. They may want to worry about big Chamber of Commerce issues. But I think all said and done, this is where we have this commonality. When we start having this rhetoric that separates us and we can't get any work done and we can't compromise, we don't move forward with our democracy. And that's
no
the big
question.
problem.
I think we just got. I would just suggest, and again, another topic that we could spend hours and hours on, that we need to be really mindful about the extremist conversation on the right and the left. Okay, I'm as progressive as it comes, but there's nothing on in the progressive space that equates as destructive as the extremities of the right side of the conversation. And there's no justification for what happened in Charlottesville. There's no justification for what we're experiencing right now as we speak with this pipe bomb conversation.
But let me just interject, Vince, to say that we can't claim that that's all on the right. For example, you will recall it was a progressive Democrat who took a semi-automatic pistol and shot up the Republican softball practice, and he was every bit as.
I don't think that's the issue, though. I think that what the issue is,
it's a policy conversation.
You can speak for yourself, Senator. I think the issue is what's our response to it. What's our response?
No, our response is
what's our response to having an assault on a reporter, which is a felony, as opposed to saying we're not going to get violent? What are we telling our citizens? What are we telling our kids? We're not condoning pipe bombs. No, it's zero tolerance for pipe bombs. It's zero tolerance for assaulting someone.
We are not without clean hands. Maxine Waters says it's okay to go and find Republican politicians that we disagree with and demonstrate outside their house, to yell at them in restaurants till they can't have a meal with their family. That's wrong. That's the type of vitriol that is tearing this country apart.
And I'm going to say that I think there's guilt on both sides. I happen to agree with the senator. I think there's a little bit more guilt on what we're hearing from the very top leader of this party.
Because they don't recognize there's a problem. We do.
The tone, the words, the conversation is not acceptable for a public official.
And our leadership denounced
whether it's defendant. By the way, this is being you can talk about the press. The press is holding holding public officials accountable. They hold me accountable as a private citizen, but a private citizen that has a lot of exposure. Be that as it may, the bottom line is we can't have someone at the very top, allowing certain language to permeate throughout our society. Because guess what? It inflames both sides.
And the Republican Party, obviously,
because he's got the biggest bully pulpit.
You're referring to President Trump, and the
Yes.
Republican Party deserves blame because when President Trump says something stupid like blaming the pipe bombs on the media, no one in the Republican Party stands up and says, no.
That's the problem.
No.
Guess why? Because he is the party. And right now, that's going to end this segment of our 2 hours.
I love Maxine Waters. I just want to be real clear about that.
So do I, but she's wrong.
I don't know about that.
People do not go to people's houses and demonstrate with their kids inside and call them all sorts
All right,
of names.
I'm going to separate. But go to your respective corners. Go to your respective corners, and we'll be back next week. And you can come out and meet in the middle of the ring, and we'll continue the conversation.
Legal Eagles Radio with Sam Pond, a Legal Eagles political special in Philadelphia on Talk Radio 1210 WPHT, in Pittsburgh on your hometown radio station, KDKA.
This program is a paid commercial announcement and in no way represents the views of WPHT or its management.